probably just get going. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's launch of Barossa Street, Rob McInroy's follow-up to the highly successful Cuddies Strip. I'm joined tonight by the author, Rob McInroy, and my fellow intern, Amy Townsend-Kennedy, who is also an intern at Ringwood Publishing, and she will be leading the Q&A section of this event. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Later on in the event, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask some of your burning questions yourself. So if you're watching on this Zoom webinar, if you could use the Q&A function or the chat function, which should be located at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions, and then Amy and I can relay them through to Rob. Or if you're joining us on our Facebook Live on Ringwood's page, then add your questions to the comments section of that live video, and we'll do the same and pass it through. So now that that's out of the way, let's get on with the launch, which I have to say we at Ringwood Publishing could not be more excited and proud to be publishing Rob's new novel and continuing on Bob Kelty's eventful life. As many of you already know, Barossa Street is the sequel to Rob's previous novel, Cuddies Strip, which followed the horrendous true crime story, which Rob has there, which followed the horrendous true crime story of the murder of Danny Kerrigan, a young man who was about to start his life with his new love, and the rape of Marjorie Fenwick, the innocent young woman who gets unceremoniously thrust into the grips of a very male-dominated judicial system that carries along with it old-fashioned ideals and a character assassination waiting to happen. The success of that novel was unsurprising, with Val McDermott commenting that it was in her top 3 picks of new fiction, stating that she highly recommended it. So the build-up to this sequel could not be more exciting, with on top of numerous prestigious awards that Rob has won, including winning the Bradford Literature Festival Northern Noir Crime Novel competition for Cuddies Strip in 2018, we now get another look into Bob Kelty's life as a now retired policeman who can't seem to put his days of policing behind him. So, Rob, let's start off with the title, Barossa Street. I see that Barossa Street is a real street in Perth. Why that particular street? Was it just a lucky dip, or is there a reason you chose it?
Yeah. Well, just before I answer that, I'll just have a quick shout out to Kev Heller, who put me onto this Barossa wine. So thank you, Kev. That's going to be my staple for the evening. Thank you for that. So Barossa Street, right? Well, I suppose I could try and sound really organised and clever and say that, yeah, of course, Barossa Street backs on to Rose Terrace, and the Connor boys, Victor and Bella Connor boy, lived on Rose Terrace. So that gave me access into the back of the property, which I need for the plot. But to be honest, I'm fairly sure I'd already decided on Barossa Street being the venue for it before I came up with that piece of plot. So I can't really claim that. It's just a street that I've always known. When back in the 80s, I used to work in the library headquarters in Rose Terrace, and then later in the Sandeman Library in Canole Street. And I lived in Crieff at the time, so I drove in every day. And Barossa Street's where I used to park every day. And it's why to this day I'm still shit hot at reversing into a parking space, because you had to take your chances on Barossa Street, because it's not that particularly long street. So you had to take your chances. So it's always been in my sort of thoughts because of that. It's the home of the Barossa Street St Johnstone Supporters Club, and I am a St Johnstone supporter. I don't get to many matches these days, but when I do, it tends to be on the Barossa Street bus that I go either up to McDermott or to the away matches. So there's that connection there. And I also think when I was doing some research for it, because research is something that I do a lot instead of writing, you find most writers will probably tell you this. I did discover that it's the only Barossa Street in the whole of Great Britain. I think there's another Barossa place in Ipswich or Norwich, I think, but there isn't another Barossa Street, so it's completely unique. So it seemed like a really good sort of venue for a novel. And I've also discovered more recently that my Auntie Margaret used to live in Barossa Street. I didn't know that. I think she always lived up in Letham when I remember. But I was speaking to my Auntie Greta when news of the book came out, and she said, "Oh yeah, your Auntie Margaret used to live there." So there's a bit of a family connection there. And I think really that about exhausts my list of interesting things to say about Barossa Street. I'm not really sure.
Okay. So for your first novel, Cuddies Strip, it was based on that horrendous true crime story that I mentioned earlier. And in that novel, you tried to faithfully recreate the events as they happened. Barossa Street, however, which we're talking about tonight, is a little bit different. Did you find it difficult now having to write a purely fictional novel with nothing to base it on? Or did you actually find that quite a liberating experience, allowing you more artistic license over the outcome?
It is loosely based on a real crime. It's a real crime that happened in 1936 somewhere in England. I can't remember where. I did want something to base the story on, just so that I could be confident that I was getting some of the details right. Things like, what forensic signs, what forensic skills did they have at that time, that sort of thing. And also particularly in the trial scene. There is a trial scene in it. And when you read that, you'll probably see what I mean, because probably quite a few of you will say, that would never happen. But actually it did. It really did happen. And it happens pretty much the way I describe it in the book. So it is based on a true crime, but I changed it quite a lot. So for example, in the real crime, it was a woman who was killed, an older woman. And I changed that to a man. Because I think one of the things that unsettles me a little bit about crime fiction is that very often the default position seems to be to bump off a woman. So I wanted to just do something a bit different this time, so I made it a man. But then I used that real crime as just a bit of a hook, and then I invented the story around it. And actually, I've got to be honest, I did find it quite hard. It's an awful lot easier when you can just go to the copies of the Courier or the PA and see what happened next, and then fictionalize that, write about that. That's an awful lot easier than having to make it all up yourself. So it was harder this time around.
Yeah, like you already have an ending, so
Yeah.
that you can just base it off it.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you could give us a brief reading from the book and give us a feel for Barossa Street.
Okay, yeah. So this is a slightly abridged version of the opening passage from the book. So this is Barossa Street. Bob Kelty sauntered past the police headquarters in Tay Street. He had no reason to be there, but he enjoyed the sensation of being able to pass the recessed front door without having to enter. Slush from heavy snowfall 2 days before covered the pavement. The River Tay was pulsing to his left. He turned onto the high street and past the Salutation Hotel. No more Saturday night fights to break up in there. No more drunkards and arguments. Last Friday had been his final day as a policeman, and now he had a week's leave before a new career beckoned, library assistant in the Sandyman Public Library. Excuse me, Constable. Approaching him, smiling, hand outstretched, was Richard Hamill. Bob remembered Hamill from when he was arrested wrongly for the murder of Danny Kerrigan and the rape of Marjorie Fenwick the previous August. I was hoping to bump into you, Hamill said. It's no every day someone tells me that. I'm worried about a friend, Hugh Smithson, Barossa Street. I left him a note a couple of days ago to say I'd be coming round last night. He didn't answer when I knocked on the door. Maybe he was out. He never goes out. He's a bit of a recluse. Never leaves the house, never speaks to anyone, except you. Well, I run errands for him, shopping, paying his bills. I'm sure there's an ordinary explanation. There usually is. Maybe he was busy. Sunday night, having his weekly bath. I think something's happened to him. How? Because it's just not like him. Will you come with me to Barossa Street? Bob sighed. Aye, I suppose so. At the far end of Barossa Street was a row of two-storey houses, most overlooking a building site for the new primary school. Bob rapped on a brass door knocker in the shape of a griffin and stepped back and waited. No one answered. He peered through the window to the left and saw a darkened sitting room. The fire was dead in the grate. A pipe rested on a table beside an armchair next to the fire. A copy of the Courier lay in the armchair. Well, said Richard Hamill. You should call the police. I did, you. I'm not the police anymore, thank God. Bob tried the door, but it was locked. The window was bolted on the inside. He crossed the road and stood on the opposite pavement and tried to gauge how far they were from the end of the street. 40 yards, maybe? It was worth a try. Come on, he said. As they turned right, the North Inch was arrayed before them, River Tay bounding it in the near distance, Scoon beyond. Where are we going? Said Hamill. Here. Bob stopped at a dark green door on Rose Terrace and knocked on it 3 times. After some moments, they could hear footsteps approaching, and the door was opened by a young woman in a maid's outfit. "Bob," she said, "whatever's the matter?" "Hello, Annie." Bob smiled shyly. "I wonder if you'd be so kind as to ask Mrs. Conboy if I could gain access to her garden." Annie stared at him, perplexed. "Why?" "Police business." "But you're..." She shook her head and closed the door. They heard her retreating into the house, and a couple of minutes later she reappeared. "Please come with me," she said. Bella Conboy was seated beneath a low-burning coal fire. She smiled at Bob. "You're on police business, I understand." "Yeah, Mr. Hamill," Bob pointed to Hamill. "He requested my assistance, ma'am. We need to get access to a house in Barossa Street, Mr. Smithson's, to check that he's in good health. Mr. Hamill is worried about him." Bella tutted with concern. "Of course, at once." Annie unlocked the back door and Richard Hamill exited into the garden. Bob made to follow, but Annie grabbed his hand and quickly, daringly, reached up and kissed him on the lips. "You'll be needing a ladder," she said. "In the shed. Fred Irons uses it to clean the windows." Bob collected the ladder and fixed it against the garden wall. He looked at Hamill. "Aye, well," he said, and started to climb unsteadily. He had no head for heights. At the top, he clambered onto the wall and started to pull the ladder up. "Hey, don't do that. I need it to get down the other side." "Yeah, but let me get up first, or I'll be stuck this side." "Oh, aye." When both men were perched on the top of the wall, they looked around. "That's it," said Hamill, pointing to an unkempt garden below them. They dropped the ladder into Hugh Smithson's garden and descended with relief. Bob peered through a grimy window into a squat and dark kitchen. A kettle sat on the hob, a bottle of milk on the sideboard. The window was locked, and Bob looked around for something to break it. He found a hefty stone by the side of the door and lifted it. Beneath was a key. "What's the point of leaving a spare key there?" he said. "You can't get in here except through the Conboy's garden." "Well, at least if it saved the expense of a broken window." Bob unlocked the door and stepped inside and halted, not sure what he was waiting for. Inspiration? Courage? "Hello," he shouted. He went into a narrow hallway filled on either side by prints of mawkish Victorian art in cheap frames. At the far end, he could see the front door. The key was in the lock. To his right was the living room he'd observed from Barossa Street. The room next door was a mirror image, smelling of staleness, still air, and tobacco. It was empty. "Hello," he shouted again as he began to climb the stairs. Fear pulsed in his throat and ears. Richard Hamill followed closely, barring any possibility of retreat. The first 2 rooms were empty, and Bob opened the door of the third. They smelled it immediately, harsh and acrid, and both of them knew this was the smell of death. Hugh Smithson's room appeared empty, everything neatly in place, except for the bed, where the bedclothes were rucked up as though someone had thrown them there in a hurry. And then Bob realized it wasn't only bedclothes he was seeing. There was something in the bed. "I think we found Mr. Smithson," he said. He eased the top blanket back. Beneath was a sheet, and he removed that too, to reveal the butchered body of Hugh Smithson. "Dear God," said Richard Hamill. And I'll leave it there.
And so Bob, yet again, gets embroiled in another terrible crime. This time, however, it's set against the backdrop of the abdication crisis in 1936. Can you tell us just a little bit about that quickly?
Yeah. George V died in 1936, January 1936. And that's just a couple of weeks after the end of Cuddies Strip. It ended in December 1935. So it felt just kind of natural to continue Bob's story and then use the funeral of George V as a backdrop to the first part of the book, and then use the abdication crisis that came on in November as the backdrop of the second part of the book. And it really was quite a fascinating period. There were genuine fears in government of civil unrest because of what was happening. And there were genuine fears about the monarchy being dissolved and Britain becoming a republic. And you have to remember, there was unrest throughout the whole of Europe at this time. There were populist, hard, right-wing governments being elected in a number of countries. In Belgium, the election was split 50-50 between the hard left communists and the hard right fascists. So real difficult times. And of course, we had the fascists in Italy, and Germany, and Spain as well. So civil rest was a real concern for the authorities. And what struck me was the repressed reporting at the time. So in January, when Edward VIII came to the throne, the newspapers were all full of praise for this modern, forward-thinking, highly intelligent man. He was going to take the monarchy forward, and he was going to be a great asset to Britain and the empire, still led the empire then. And of course, we now know that was absolute rubbish, and they knew it was rubbish. Even in January, the government already knew about Edward's relationship with Mrs. Simpson, and they knew that things could boil over. And they also knew what Edward was really like. So far from being this modern, forward-thinking, highly intelligent man, he was feckless. He was spoiled, he was arrogant, and he was quite possibly, even at that time, had fascist tendencies. Certainly high up in government, they were very concerned about his friendship with von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, and other German people. So the affair with Mrs. Simpson, it was reported really heavily in the foreign newspapers, but there was absolutely nothing in the UK. There was a complete embargo on it. And until, absolutely inadvertently, the Bishop of Bradford let the cat out of the bag in a sermon one Sunday in November, when he started talking about the king and his duty and what he should be doing. And this got reported on the Monday in all of the national papers, and people started thinking, what's going on? And then it all kicked off. So all the newspapers who had dutifully not been printing anything about it, they all started reporting it. So it all kicked off at that point, and everything was now in the open. And so in the novel, one of the themes that I wanted to explore is the idea of truth, and the way that truth is sometimes concealed or altered to suit a particular point of view. So that's what goes on in the main plot of the novel, and it's mirrored then in the way that the establishment handled the abdication crisis.
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels between the two, definitely. So I'd like to talk about Annie for a little bit. She was in Cuddies Strip. She knew Bob when he first arrived in Perth after the death of his father and looked after him a little bit. She plays a much larger role in Barossa Street, becoming a fully rounded character rather than a love interest as a way of showing Bob's softer side. Was it always your intention to throw Annie into the midst of solving this case and making her into this headstrong and, dare I say, feisty character?
Yeah, it was. I consciously, from the start, I wanted to make Annie a strong-minded woman. In historical fiction, you have to do it within limits, obviously, because at the time, women's place in society was entirely different from what it is now. And I mean, frankly, they were expected to be deferential, they were expected to be weak, to do what they were told. So you kind of got to reflect that to an extent, because that was the lives that they lived at that time. But my character, Annie, was never going to be like that. She's much more her own woman. And she needs to be like that, because it's what Bob Kelty needs. Bob is very low on self-confidence. He's prone to depression. He's potentially suffering PTSD from the death of his father, although obviously PTSD didn't exist, wasn't acknowledged at that time, but he probably was. And so realistically, he was always going to need a strong woman to help him through. So that's what I wanted to make Annie. In Cuddies Strip, she had more of a minor role in Cuddies Strip, because the strong female role in that book was more Bella Connerboy. But I wanted to develop her in this novel, and we'll increasingly see that as the series progresses.
Annie does do some of the investigative work in Barossa Street, but it is still largely Bob leading the way. Do you see Annie's role as investigator becoming stronger as we go along?
Yeah, it definitely will do. And especially in a later book, book 4. So this is book 2. I'm writing book 3 at the moment. Book 4 is going to be set during the Second World War. And so Bob is naturally going to be away some of the time in that one. So she will actually be the lead character. Her and someone that you haven't met yet. She hasn't appeared in the first 2 books. She won't appear in the third one either. She will appear in the fourth book, and she's going to really shake everything up. I can't wait to write about her. But Annie will be the lead character, and I think what we have with both Bob and Annie, they're 2 people who are not trained. They're not detectives. They don't have any particular skills in detection or police work or anything, but they are both very tenacious, and they're very smart, and they're very principled, and they work very well together. They're a proper team. So yeah, in the future ones, Annie will be having much more of a part in it, and she will be leading some of the investigation.
The reason I ask is because in Barossa Street, there is actually a couple of really funny scenes when Bob and Annie individually do some investigating, interviewing some of the older residents in Perth. And it's fair to say that it doesn't quite work out entirely as planned for either of them. Annie goes to interview someone called Mrs. Black. Perhaps you could give us a taste of that particular encounter.
Right. Okay. So in this scene and in the one before it, Bob and Annie they're trying to find out about the dead man Hugh Smithson's life in years gone by, because they think that might help them find out what happened with the crime. So they split up to interview some old friends of Hugh Smithson. Bob goes to the pub to speak to a couple of old dominoes players. And in this scene, Annie, as you said, she's calling on Mrs. Black, who is a friend of Hugh Smithson's wife. So the house on the end of Rose Lane, next to the corner shop on Long Causeway, was dingy and run down. Window frames rotting, roof bowed, door and windows filthy. Annie took a moment to compose herself before knocking on the door. Mrs. Black? Aye. The old woman peered suspiciously from behind her front door. My name's Annie Maybury. I'm Betsy Maybury's lassie. Fuse Road. Aye. Oh, come away in, hen. Heavens, I mind when you were a wee bairn. Do you remember that time you shat yourself at the Sunday school picnic in the North Inch? Your mother was black affronted. Annie had no memory of this and was certain that no such event had occurred. But she smiled politely and followed the woman into a sparse, freezing living room. A coal fire was almost out, a single plume of smoke, more a thread rising from it. I've coal in the yard, Mrs. Black said, but I can't lift it. No one must see her arm. She eased herself into a threadbare armchair. Would you like me to fetch you some in? Would you, hen? Oh, that'd be awfully kind of you. It's been the yard. And when you've done, I didn't suppose you'd mind chopping me an ingon and peeling some tatties and all. My rheumatics is playing up the day. It's the damp. Annie hesitated. Aye, she said. The rheumatics is a terrible business. I mind my gran getting it. Oh, you've no idea, lassie. Annie gathered a bucket of coal from the bunker in the yard and left it on the hearth. Would you like me to put some on the fire for you now? No, the new. It's fine as it is. Annie shivered as she retreated to the kitchen to chop the onion and peel some potatoes. Make sure and chop the tatties nice and wee, so they bile better. I can't abide a firm tatty. When she was done, Annie asked if Mrs. Black would like a cup of tea. Oh, that would be grand, hen, if it's no bother. None at all. She went back to the kitchen and found the tea caddy and boiled some water in the range. She searched the cupboards but could only find one cup. Bone china, much stained and lightly chipped. Have you another cup? She shouted through the wall. No, I just have the one. Right. She filled the teapot and carried it and the single cup through to Mrs. Black and sat opposite and watched as the old woman poured her tea and sat back and sipped it. That's hot. Which is more than I am, thought Annie, shivering in her swagger coat. I wanted to ask you about Hugh Smithson, she said. He's dead. Aye, I ken. Did you ken him? When he worked at Bell's? Aye, he made my Jim's life a misery, jumped up little arsehole. He was a bit of a loner, was he no? Never left the house. Was he aye like that? No idea. And he was friends with Henry Hamill. Did you ken him? Stuck up shite. Thought he was better than nobody else. Did they get on well, Smithson and Hamill? I couldn't tell you, hen. She sipped her tea and stared at it suspiciously. How much tea did you put in the pot? 4 teaspoons. Hell, lassie, do you think I'm made of money? Sorry. Annie sighed. This wasn't what she'd anticipated at all. Last night, lying in bed, she'd gone through this over and over again, what she was going to say, what Mrs. Black might say. She crafted the conversation like one of her mother's detective novels, Annie slowly revealing the truth. But I tell you who might, Ken. Aye? Annie's heart lurched with sudden anticipation. Maybe it would work out after all. Gladys Comer. Who's she? She was best friends with Maisie Smithson. Aye, together that pair. She sniffed. Where does she live? Spends most of her time in St. John's Kirk, unpaid skivvy for the minister. Right enough, she's plenty of guilty secrets she needs to atone for. She'll need all the help she can get, that one, come Judgment Day. You'll find her there. Thank you. Annie made her eyes. Before you go, lassie, the blankets on my bed are in a riff fankle, and with my back, aye, of course, leave it to me. You're a credit to your mother. I'll mind and tell her that next time I see her.
I feel like we all know a Mrs. Black, someone with absolutely no vocal filter, prepared to at once offend and embarrass you, but phrase it as a compliment. Where did this lovely character come from?
I think it's a Scottish thing, really, and particularly with some of the older generations. Scots people, we tend not to stand in ceremony. We don't like people putting on airs and graces, and if we think they are, stamp on it pretty quickly. We say things, we see them. And so I think that's Mrs. Black, really. And I think also she's extremely manipulative. Basically, she got Annie to do all her chores for the day, and Annie didn't even get a cup of tea out of it. Again, I think that's probably a particular skill you see in older Scottish people. They can wrap the younger ones around their little finger. So in the previous scene, exactly the same thing happens to Bob when he meets the dominoes players. They just run rings around them. It's an occupational hazard to being Scottish, I think.
There is quite a lot of humour in this book, but it is balanced quite nicely by the way it looks at some of the more serious issues. In Cuddies Strip, there was a lot of police politics at play, which was one of the reasons that Bob decided to leave the police at the start of Barossa Street. Quite a lot of the focus in Cuddies Strip was on misogyny in the way that women were treated by society and by the justice system. In Barossa Street, there are a lot of differing factors at play, with preconceived opinions clouding the judgment of the police and the media from the outset. Is this your way of highlighting that systems like this, like the policing and the judicial system, can't change, or maybe perhaps that they won't change?
Well, I think certainly things haven't changed. Whether they can change, I think probably we need to wait and see. But it's difficult to be entirely confident about it, given that we see the same things happening now as I'm writing about back in the 1930s. Maybe not as bad. I mean, Marjorie wouldn't be treated as badly today, but still the way that women who report rape are treated is sometimes scandalous. And the investigation of rape is sometimes scandalous. And the conviction rate for rape is genuinely scandalous. And we know that homophobia is still present in society. And we know that racism is present in society. And it's interesting that yesterday marked the inquiry into the death of Sheku Bayo, 7 years after the incident took place. And that inquiry is going to look at the incident itself, is going to look at how the police dealt with the aftermath, what the subsequent investigation was, and whether race was a factor in what happened. And I really hope that the police and the wider criminal justice system take this opportunity to look honestly at their culture. But my fear is that they will become defensive about it. And what I would also like is for the rest of us to acknowledge that the culture that we see in the police is a reflection of the wider culture in society. There is still a lot of prejudice out there. And I want to try and draw that out in my books. Using historical fiction, I think, is a really good way of holding up a mirror to the present day. And so it's historical fiction. It is fiction. It's not social history. But what it can do is allow us to see ourselves through a different lens. So perhaps be more objective about ourselves as a society, and perhaps allow us to imagine how we might change and what that change might be.
We do certainly see some prejudice at play in Barossa Street, but without giving too much away, Bob is instrumental in dealing with it. Do you think it's up to individuals to stand up to the prejudice, or is it something that society has to tackle as a whole?
Well, it has to be both, really, because change must come from the society for it to be truly embedded. But society is made up of all of us individuals, so it has to be both. And perhaps sometimes we need all of us to be a bit braver and call out prejudice actions or words when we see and hear them. And it's difficult to do that, because if you look at the context, we've got a UK government that's actively fomenting mistrust of the other by the way it tries to demonize asylum seekers, the way that they're deliberately conflating asylum seekers who are escaping oppression in their countries with economic migrants. And it's difficult when you've got policing which underestimates the importance of acts of violence against women and girls, or against gay people, or against Black people. So looking at the Sarah Everard case, she might not have been killed if her killer had been apprehended for flashing only days before, but it wasn't considered serious enough by the Met Police. What you find, these sorts of events are always on the spectrum, and offenders tend to start at the less serious end, but if they're not stopped, they'll move gradually towards more serious offending. And I think we just, as a society, we just need to be more honest about that.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe you could give us another brief reading just to show us exactly what Bob was up against.
Okay, so in this scene, Bob is taking Sergeant Braggan to the scene of the murder. Braggan has just been brought in to lead the investigation. As they climbed the stairs, Bob filled Sergeant Braggan in on Eliza Kennell's evidence about Richard Hamill. He shared his concerns about her reliability. Braggan turned on the upstairs landing. If Hamill's got tink blood on him, there'll be something wrong somewhere. Stands to reason. They cause trouble everywhere they go, those bastards. Tinks and knives go together as well. Mainly because they never get a gun license. As of now, he's our number one suspect. I want him in for questioning. He was in this morning, made a full statement. To who? Sergeant Petrie. Well, there you go then. That'll be worth hee-haw. Get him back in. I need to speak to him. He entered the bedroom and studied the bed. So how did you find the body? In the bed there, under the blankets, like he'd been fast asleep or covered up. Braggan lifted the blankets to reveal the blood-stained sheet. He studied the knife marks in the blanket and gauged their length with thumb and forefinger. Jesus, he said, there must have been some blood. He returned downstairs to the kitchen and peered into the Belfast sink beneath the window. Have you touched this? He said. No. That knife would have been dripping with blood, and it must have been huge. You can tell by the size of those cuts in the bedding. There's no knife being washed in this sink. It's totally clean. Aye, Sergeant. Make sure we ask people about seeing anyone carrying a knife when we're doing door to door. Bob felt sure that seeing a man with a knife dripping blood was probably evidence people would offer up of their own volition, but he said he would. Right, Braggan said, I've seen all there is to see here. Let's go. I wonder if I might stay on, Sergeant, just have another look around. Why? Well, the initial inspection was undertaken by Sergeant Petrie, and I say no more, but be back in an hour. Braggan headed for the door, but turned back. And remember to lock up behind you, for God's sake. Bob returned to the kitchen and leaned into the sink and studied it. As Braggan had pointed out, it was very clean. Suspiciously so, given the condition of the rest of the house and the foodstuffs left lying in the kitchen top. Hugh Smithson did not seem a man much given to domestic routine. Bob opened the sideboard drawers, looking for cutlery. In the second drawer, he found a tray of knives and forks, all thrown in randomly. Among them was a large carving knife. Bob took out his handkerchief, lifted the knife and took it to the window where there was better light. The knife was perhaps 9 inches long, a good inch wide at the base, very sharp. That seemed a reasonable match with the wound on Smithson's body. Where the blade joined the handle, there was brown staining that could have been blood. The new forensic science they were developing could surely analyse that and determine if it was human. he wrapped a knife in his handkerchief and took it back to the station. So in that scene, I think Bob is already suspecting that Bragan has made up his mind, and he's not conducting a full search or investigation. Meanwhile, as you can see, Bob is unconvinced.
And that's what spurs him on.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, taking it in a different direction now, in Cuddies Strip, Bob made mention of opening a cafe and teaching music in the back. That dream resurfaces again in Barossa Street, and Bob starts taking steps to make it a reality. He even has a name for it, Cloudland. Now, I know you've written another book called Cloudland, so I'm assuming they're linked.
Yeah, they are. Cloudland was actually the first novel I wrote. It's not been published yet, but I hope it will be in time. And it's set in Crieff, which is my hometown. It's 17 miles from Perth, in 1985. And Bob Kelty is a character in this. Obviously, it's 1985. He's now in his 70s. And he's running this place called Cloudland, which is a cafe in the centre of Crieff. It's in James Square in Crieff. And Cloudland is a bit of a rallying point for a collection of misfits and downbeats and losers. And going back to Cuddies Strip, when I was writing that, I was conscious of a short story that I wrote some years ago about a little boy whose father kills himself. That actually got published last year in New Writing Scotland, that little boy became Bob, and it gave him the backstory that you've read in Cuddies Strip about his father killing himself. But then I also realized when I was working on Cuddies Strip that the little boy who became Bob Kelty, the young policeman in Cuddies Strip, was also this old man in Cloudland. So this 70-year-old man that I'd been writing about in Cloudland helped me develop Bob's character as a young man. I knew what he was like when he was 70. So what would he have been like as a young man to end up the way he did? So I now had Bob all the way from the age of 12 right through to his 70s. And that really opened up a whole new set of ideas for me, based around this idea of following Bob's life all the way through. So I've now got 10 books planned in the series, which will take us from 1935 through to 2014, and it will take in the whole of Bob Kelty's life. So that's my next target, living long enough to write 10 more books.
And why Cloudland, the name? Where did the name come from? Was it, as Bob says in Barossa Street, a play on his gran, what she used to say about him always having his head in the clouds?
Yeah, well, Bob will certainly say that, but actually it comes from one of my favourite novels. It's the Man with the Golden Arm by Nelson Algren, which I think probably is here somewhere. Yeah. Yes. The Man with the Golden Arm. It was filmed with Frank Sinatra in the title role as well, if you want to watch the film version. It's about a group of deadbeats in Chicago in probably the 1930s, I should think. And at one point it says the junkies had nicknamed their restaurant that they frequented Cloudland, because it was precisely at this transfer point that those for whom there was nothing to do and nowhere to go on the ground got their transfers to the stratosphere. Now, my characters in Cloudland, they don't do drugs, they're not junkies, but they are nonetheless, they're people with nothing to do and nowhere to go. And I just felt they had an awful lot in common with the deadbeats that Nelson Algren wrote about. So I just thought the name Cloudland really worked, and basically I just stole it from him.
So we know that Bob ends up living the dream in Crieff, but what is next for Bob Kelty? You say there's going to be 10 books. Does this mean that we can expect him back on the page anytime soon?
Yeah, I do love the idea of living the dream in Crieff. Yeah, I'm working on the second draft of the third book now. This is my working copy of it. What I tend to do is get them printed up. When I've finished every draft, I get it printed up so that I can then write all over it. I find it much easier to be objective and critical about it if it actually looks and feels like a book. So I'm working on this at the moment. It's set in Crieff, in July 1939, so basically about 6 weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War. It's spread over 2 weeks, and basically what you're talking about is the last gasp of civilization before the world descends into 6 years of horror. And the next book after that, book 4, will start on the day that war is declared. And that, the declaration of war, is going to cause Bob some serious soul searching. And there's going to be some real big changes in store for him. It's going to be a real serious test for him.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. So thank you, Rob. I think now is a good time to start adding in some audience questions, so I don't take up all of your time myself. So as I said before, if anyone would like to ask a question, use the Q&A and chat functions at the bottom of the webinar or the comment section on the Facebook Live video, and then we can relay them through to Rob. So I'll now pass you over to Amy. And Amy, why don't you get us started?
Hiya. So first question we've got for you, Rob. Was it a conscious decision to make Bob Kelty quite a quiet and sympathetic character when compared to his police colleagues, almost polar opposites actually, particularly with Sergeant Braggan, who also featured in Cuddies Strip?
Yeah, I did. I really wanted, from the very start, I wanted him to be different from usual crime fiction police heroes. You get a bit of a cult of masculinity with a lot of crime detectives, even when some of them, even when they're actually women. They're often almost men in disguise. So they tend to be tough, they tend to be aloof, they tend to be obsessed with the job, they've got a difficult family life, they're very often drinkers. And I wanted something entirely different. So my first thought was to have someone who was a police officer, but was completely and utterly hopeless at it. And Bob, to be fair to him, is no good as a policeman. He just hasn't got the practical skills that you need to be a policeman. But he's very clever and he's intuitive. And so despite himself, he's actually a very good detective. Terrible policeman, but a good detective. And so that was the initial idea that I wanted. Someone who's good at it without any real understanding of why or how he's good at it. And then going back to the short story I talked about, that gave me the backstory, and that filled in a lot of the rest of his character. So this sort of very lacking in confidence and prone to seeing the dark side of things. So that helped to fill in the character. And he's very much a force of decency in the books. So he's the moral center of the story. He was in Cuddies Strip and he is in this one, and you'll see that you'll see that all the way through. So he's not a good policeman, but he is genuinely a very good man.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Kenny Jack in the chat. Interesting that you appear to imply early in the novel that becoming a library assistant is more useful than being a police officer. Is this how you intended this to be read?
Hi, Kenny. Kenny is my cousin, and I used to be a library assistant. Kenny used to be a police officer. So no, it isn't really, but it's the mindset that Bob was in at that time. At the end of Cuddies Strip, he was quite disillusioned with the justice system, and that's why he resigned from the police. And he just saw being a library assistant as a new opportunity for him and a new development. So I think it's more a reflection of where he was at the time.
Okay, thank you. Without having a true story to follow, did you have to do some investigating yourself to figure out what breadcrumb trail of clues to leave in order to discover the murderer? Don't give too much away in case people haven't finished the book yet.
Yeah, I kind of made it up as I went along to quite a large extent. I knew the how, but I didn't know the who or the why to begin with. They did come later on. And that means, of course, that when you're writing it, you have to go back and do a fair bit of rewriting in the second and the third drafts. You have to put in new scenes because you've changed your mind about things. You have to change the emphasis in some scenes. It's not really the kind of whodunit where there's lots of clues for the attentive reader to pick up and solve the crime. It's not really that kind of crime novel, but there are things that needed to go into it for the story to make sense. So there are a lot of changes along the way, much more than there was in Cuddies Strip. I did have to go back and do quite a lot of rewriting this time.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question from Flora. She says she loves the picture on the cover. Can you tell us about it? Is this the real Barossa Street, and when was it taken?
That's a really interesting question, Flora. And the answer is we're not entirely sure. It came from Perth Museum. I went to the archives and they didn't have anything there. I went to the Perth Museum and they came up with this as being Barossa Street, 1940s, which I thought was near enough. But the museum curators looked at this photograph and I looked at this photograph and we all agreed that doesn't really look like Barossa Street, because it's cropped in the picture for the book. But to this end of it, you can see the road starts to slope quite markedly down towards Athol Street. And it doesn't. The real Barossa Street doesn't do that. And so I did ask on Facebook if people who lived there in days gone by remembered a slope on Barossa Street. And some of them did, but what they were describing to me was probably going the wrong way. So what we kind of suspect is it's definitely Perth and it's definitely 1940s, but it may not be Barossa Street. But it looked good enough, I thought. And we have got some provenance because it does say in the Perth Museum catalogue, Barossa Street.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I know you spoke earlier about certain difficulties you had going from writing a true story to writing a wholly fictional one. I was wondering what sort of difficulties you had in writing another crime novel. Was there anything you did specifically in order to ensure you weren't just sort of rehashing the same structure?
Yeah, this one is different. So in Cuddies Strip, you knew from the start who the murderer was. And the book was then about finding out whether the police would catch the criminal in time before he killed and raped again. And this time I decided that you wouldn't know who the murderer was, the reader wouldn't know that. So the reader is in the same boat as the detectives. And structurally, there is one big difference in this novel, but I can't say too much about that because I know there are some clever crime readers listening in, and they will immediately work out what that means and what that means for the story. So I can't say it, but structurally there is one big difference. And in my next one, which is the one that I'm working on at the moment, I'm going to be trying to play with the conventions of the crime novel even more. Again, I can't say too much about what that is, but the ending will be very different from the endings of both Cuddies Strip and Barossa Street.
Okay, brilliant. I'm very excited for the next one, so can't wait for those. We've got a question from Fred. When basing narratives on true crime events, is there a time where you've had to choose between prioritizing accuracy in order to respect the real life victims and you wanting to inject some fictional elements to benefit the story / book as a whole?
Yeah, very much that, Fred. In Cuddies Strip, which was the one that was really based on a true crime, I didn't invent anything about Marjorie Fenwick, who was the female victim of it. I deliberately chose not to do that. Anything that's in that book is recorded in the evidence in either the crime, the court materials, or the newspaper stuff at the time. And I was really sensitive about that. And I was also sensitive about some of the men doing the investigation. Because clearly in my book, the investigation wasn't wholly successful. And that would be extremely unfair if I was to write about the policemen who were genuinely involved in that, who I expect were extremely good, extremely motivated, and extremely competent within the restrictions of the time, and started to make sort of negative comments about them. That would not be appropriate. So what I did, any time that I was inventing something which had any sort of negative connotations for anybody in real life, I changed it, so I made them a completely fictional person because I really didn't want to do that. It felt really important to me that I didn't do that.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is something we all like to know. Do you have any literary inspirations when writing your books, or did you take any inspiration from any particular novels or authors in terms of like your structure?
Not particularly in terms of the structure, particularly. The authors that I'm particularly drawn to, the first one would be Carson McCullers, American novelist, died late 50s, early 60s, I think. And she wrote some fantastic books. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. She wrote that when she was 23, which is just extraordinary because the depth of understanding of human nature that she managed to bring to that book and to other books like The Member of the Wedding, simply astonishing. And what McCullers did was she picked on people who are slightly outside the mainstream of society, different in some way. And she focused on them, and that's kind of what I like to do, is pick up on some of the outsiders, the disconnected from society. So she's been a big influence. Marilyn Robinson, who's a contemporary American novelist, has been a really big influence, again because of that character. It's very much character that I'm interested in. So she's an extraordinary novelist. She's done the Gilead novels, which are now a tetralogy. There's 4 of them. And she also wrote Housekeeping, which is just a sensationally good book. And I would just love to spend time with Ruth and Sylvie from that book. And the other one that I always talk about is The Catcher in the Bell Jar, Sylvia Plath, which tends to get compared with The Catcher in the Rye, but they're totally different. I think The Catcher in the Rye is completely shallow when you compare it with The Bell Jar. It's just an amazing book, again looking at a very troubled individual. And another one that I would pick up on now is one that I just read fairly recently. It's O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker. I found that an absolute revelation. She wrote it in the 1980s, and it's an absolute modern classic of Scottish literature. It's nowhere near as famous as it should be. Her way of describing really massively unconventional characters is just astonishing. Some people who are absolute monsters, and some people who, in real life you wouldn't want to spend time with them, but on the page you can't. They're irresistible. Absolutely superb. The author, she died about 10 days ago, which is a real shame. And this was her only novel, but I've got to say, what a novel! So I heartily recommend that. Elspeth Barker, O Caledonia.
Great. There's a real range there. That's really great. Thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Emma. Are you able to provide some more insight into your research process? Where do you start? Is it the same process for every book you write?
Research is my thing. I said at the start, I prefer researching to writing, to be honest. I'm a former librarian, so I would do, wouldn't I? What I want to do, when I've decided when it's going to be set, I will read all of the local newspapers from the time, and not just about, in both books, it's been a crime that I've picked on, but I haven't just picked up on those crimes. I read everything else from that period in the local newspapers, because you get a real sense of how people felt and believed and behaved in those times from reading the papers. And it's not just the news items, it's the adverts as well. So the adverts for dyspepsia and stuff, and smelly feet, all of that sort of stuff that all of the adverts for. You just get a real feeling for what the society was like at the time. So I do a lot of that. When it was Cuddies Strip, I went to the National Archives in Edinburgh to go through all of the court materials for that as well. And that was really important, because that's where I picked up all of the medical records from the investigations of the autopsy for Danny and the serial investigations they did on Marjorie. And you know, the book I'm doing now, it's set in a camp that took place just before the war started. So I've done a lot of research into that, and obviously I'm in my element with the fourth book because it's about the war. So this shelf here, I don't know, can you see that? All of this is my current research shelf for all the 1930s material. So 1930s are not up to the war. So this is what I'm working through at the moment. I need to stop myself. I always do. I can just go down little rabbit holes forever, researching more and more arcane things. And that's why you get some odd things in the books, because a lot of things just really happened. So there's an incident with a swan in Barossa Street. It happened. It was real. And you just think, well, that's so good. I'll stick that in.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, you can really tell that they're really well researched, and I really thought that aspect of it was amazing. Okay, so we've got another question here from Elaine. So she's written, I'm intrigued at the draft of the book in progress you print, then do your own notes with a big red pen. Did you read about someone else doing that, and why do you think it's beneficial? I'm really going to follow that up.
No, I haven't read anyone else doing it. It just, I did it with Cloudland, and it really helped, because it's okay editing on a screen on A4, but it still looks like a draft, and it's kind of hard to take yourself out of the writer that you are and be objective and be a reader. So I decided with Cloudland what I would do was get it printed, because you can get it print on demand privately. So it's not available anywhere. Nobody else can see it. I just got one copy printed. It cost about £7-8. So it's actually probably cheaper than printing it out anyway on A4 paper. Dead cheap, but you see the quality is pretty good. It looks like a book. And so I can go through this now and much more easily read it as a reader would read it and think, no, that's not working. That just doesn't fit. So it just helps me to do it, and I've been doing it this way for quite a long time. So I use lulu.com, Lulu.com, and you just upload it all, and it comes in 10 days or so, and then you can start your editing. So I find it really successful.
I think that's a great idea. I might have to do that with my dissertation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I did do that with my dissertation.
Oh.
That's it. That was that was my thesis, and I did do exactly the same thing. This is my PhD thesis, and I did exactly the same thing with that.
I see. Mine have all been online submissions, so I don't even have to get it bound or anything. So I've nothing. So that would be a great thing to do. Okay. Anyone have any other questions? If you wanted to pop them in the chat.
I have a question. I know that you said the story was loosely based on a true story, but did you decide, without giving too much away, sorry, did you decide who the murderer would be from the start, or did you was it a work in progress?
No, I didn't know from the start who did it. I knew what the crime was. I knew how it was committed, but that was really all I knew. I didn't know anything else. So no, I had to work it all out as I went along. And it surprised me in the end, to be honest, but better that way, I guess. I've just done that in the draft that I'm writing at the moment. I killed off a character, and I don't know who was more surprised, the character or me. It just kind of happened. So I do feel quite guilty about it, but he had his time.
I also can't believe what you said about that swan instance being true. Where did you find that?
It was in the PA. It was in the Perth Advertiser. Swan running amok on the town bridge, and had to be escorted off.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we've got come through in the chat. If anyone has any more, please feel free to pop them on.
I have one.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
So you use Scots dialect, obviously, for a lot of the characters, which is great. Do you think that it's important to stay true to obviously like our or their dialect? Is that something that you would continue on throughout the rest of your books?
Yeah, I do find that is really important to me, that I do that. And you will notice if you look at Bob Kelty's speech, when he's speaking to Bella or Victor Conboy, he speaks in proper English. He doesn't speak in Scots. But when he's speaking to everybody else, he speaks in Scots, because there has always been that thing. You've got to speak proper. You can't speak that slang rubbish. We all got that drummed into us at school. You weren't allowed to speak like that. And I really wanted to make it authentic like that. I wanted him to speak proper Scots, because he would have done. He's a working class boy. He came from farming stock. He would have been a proper Scots speaker. So I wanted to maintain that. And there's quite a lot of debate going on in Scotland at the moment about this, about whether Scots is a language or it's just a dialect of English, and should we be speaking it in formal places. Billy Kay gave an address in the Scots Parliament a couple of weeks ago, and that's been incredibly polarising. A lot of people saying it's fantastic for Scotland that in our Scottish Parliament we are speaking Scots, and a lot of people saying it's an embarrassment, it's terrible, it's slang, you shouldn't be doing it. But I'm very much on the side of it's the language of Scotland, and people will speak it, and so I want to reflect it in the book.
Yeah, we actually, because I work in a gift shop for a castle for the National Trust, and we have fairy tales and retellings of everyday, kind of stories that children know and that we know as well, written in Scots. We had a colleague of mine said, "Oh, I didn't realise it was a real language." And I said, "Well, you can read Rapunzel in it now." And I also think it's really crucial to develop like a character's persona as well, like you said, like the differences in how we're brought up and how we're portrayed. So yeah, I too think it's really important to keep it going.
Yeah.
I must say, as a non-Scot as well, it was a really nice addition to the book to read it in the dialects and stuff. It added such a depth to the character, and it wasn't like incomprehensible or anything. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, great, excellent.
This might seem a bit of a silly one, but when I was reading it, I was like, I could picture this as a TV show or like a film. Is that something that you have maybe in the back of your mind when you're writing, or is it not there at all? Are you like, that would be great, but you're not even thinking about it, kind of thing?
More, I think, with Cuddies Strip, the way it was written, it was very, very episodic, and you could easily see that sort of jump shots from one thing to another, transferring onto screen. Because I like to take in the countryside and the scenery as well. I think there is quite a filmic quality to the books. So yeah, I'd love to see them filmed.
We've got a question in the chat as well from Emma. She says, you mentioned how your experience as a librarian influenced your research process. In what other ways has your background influenced the way that you write?
I did an MA in creative writing at Hull University as a mature student, and then I went on and did a PhD also at Hull University, and I think that has had quite an impact on the way that I write, because of the researching side, because of the making sure that you're covering everything, that you can justify everything that you're putting in. So I think there's a lot of that in there, and I think a lot of my writing style and approach came from back in the mid 2000s when I was a member of an online writing group called Book Camp, Alex Keegan's boot camp, which was just brutal, absolutely brutal. Everything had to be submitted anonymously because you were supposed to be reviewing the text, not the author, and you were encouraged to just go for the throat, really say what was wrong about it. So it was a really brutal environment. You had to stand up to it. Some people couldn't manage it. I was all right with it because I work in local government, so I get told I'm wrong all the time. So it didn't bother me, but it really instilled a writing sort of regime for me, which was write, just write all the time, keep writing. So in boot camp, we had to submit short stories every 2 weeks, and then do critiques of everybody else's. So you'd be critiquing up a dozen stories every 2 weeks, plus writing your next one. So it was really, really rigid. And at that time, I was writing about 500,000 words a year of various things, either my fiction or reviews of other people's writing or articles. So that was a real sort of, it's an apprenticeship, isn't it? It's the first 1,000,000 words is your apprenticeship, I think Ray Bradbury said. And that really sort of instilled a lot of what I do now into me when I was writing that stuff then. So I kind of call on that a lot. And also because of the really brutal critiques you got, particularly from Alex Keegan himself, you don't forget those lessons. So, for example, one thing that absolutely drives me mad in novels is when characters keep saying each other's names to them. So, yes, John, that's right, Dave. But what do you think, John? Well, I'm not quite sure, Dave. You read it and you see even really famous, highly regarded authors, they've got these characters, they just keep saying each other's names all the time. And it drives me mad because it doesn't happen in real life. And that's one lesson that absolutely stayed with me because I got pulled apart for it by Alex Keegan in 2005.
Yeah, I must say that really annoys me as well, especially like when they do it in TV shows too, because you can hear it and I'm like, someone has not gone through this script and checked this because it is really irritating.
Yeah, read it aloud.
Indeed.
Everything you do, read it aloud.
Well, I mean, that leads us on to a great question we have from Sarah, who has asked, are there any plans to make this into an audiobook? It would sound great to be read by a Scot.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, that. And that came up on Twitter a while back. It's difficult because the market is possibly quite small. But I do think it might be an idea, and I hope my publishers listen to this, that some of the small indie publishers might think about getting together and looking at doing audio versions of works, because I think there would be a market for it. I think people are possibly a bit dismissive about it and say there wouldn't be a market. I think there would. I really do think there would be a market for it. So I would love to see that.
Yeah, I think that would be great too. So we've got a question come in from Facebook from Simon, who says, do you think that you really wanted to be a detective, Rob?
Yeah, I probably wanted, like Bob, I would have been absolutely shit policeman because I'm even more handless and clueless than he is. But yeah, detective, yeah, quite possible. I think you might be right. You might be right, Simon. And obviously, Simon was a detective himself, so you can see his detecting skills coming to the fore. He's got me sussed.
That's great. Okay, any more questions from anyone in the chat or any of the panelists, if you've got any more questions?
I've actually just seen a good comment from Mark Gallagher. He said, Ray Bradbury, write one short story a week, and at the end of the year, you'll have 52 short stories, and I defy you to write 52 bad ones. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, inspiring.
I was going to ask if you had any like hints or just for people who are looking to get into the publishing industry. Obviously, it's I imagine quite difficult from my my perspective anyway. So how are you finding the whole editing process? Like, how did you find getting into publishing?
It's really hard, and it's getting harder, unfortunately, because so much. All of the big publishing companies, they're all merging into one another. So it's Penguin, Random House, God knows what else now. They're all one bloody company. So it's getting really hard, and they're focusing on big names. They're focusing on celebrities. So people like me, it's really hard to get in. But I think in Scotland at the moment, it's actually really vibrant. There's some really good independent publishers out there, like Ringwood, there's Taproot, Tippermuir. There are a number of Scottish independents who are willing to do something different. They're willing to take on books that mainstream publishers just won't pick up. So I think that's been really, really positive. And I hope that continues. I really would like to see that continue. I think if you look at Ringwood, which publishes me, you look at the roster of people they've got on, they've got, and the sorts of books they're producing, they're absolutely fantastic. The range of stuff that they're publishing is really, really excellent, and the quality is just excellent. I'm not blowing my own trumpet. I know we've got some Ringwood authors here tonight, and I would say to them, what you're producing is absolutely brilliant. And with any luck, the rest of the publishing world might pick up on this in due course. But it's difficult to get into. And in terms of, people like yourselves trying to get into the publishing world, it is really hard. It's so competitive at the moment. Just trying to get your first foot on the ladder, first rung on the ladder, it's really hard. And again, Ringwood, I think, do some really good stuff on that in providing these internship opportunities for people who are doing publishing courses and those sorts of courses. I think it's a really, really great move.
Yeah, there's many of us who have said that we learned a lot and thoroughly enjoyed like proofreading Barossa Street, and yeah, I just think it's been great to read and great to hear all about it, really.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we've had so far. So I'll hand back to you, Ellie, if that's everyone finished.
Yeah, so after that great discussion with some great questions from all of you, thank you for sending them through. I think that's all we've got time for. So if anything has piqued your interest tonight, then I urge you all to head over to Ringwood's website and pick yourselves up a copy of Barossa Street. It is also worth noting that Barossa Street as well as Cuddies Strip are also available on ebook. So if that is more your thing, then head over and download a copy of them. So yeah, all I have left to do is thank you, Rob, for creating another great book. And thank you all for joining us at this launch. Rob, is there any final words you'd like to say?
Just thank you to you, Amy, Ellie, and Jasmine. Thank you for being fantastic hosts tonight, and I've really enjoyed it. And just thanks to Sandy, my publisher. I've just said, I think what he does with Ringwood Publishing and everyone at Ringwood, I think they're producing some brilliant stuff. And long may it continue. So thank you for the opportunity to have my books published.
I will also just add a quick reminder that there is another Ringwood event, Glasgow Crime Writing, by those who know, for those who care, which is taking place on the 25th of May. So we'd love to see as many of you there as possible for what promises to be a very interesting discussion. And we will also be announcing the winner of our prize draw at that event too. So be sure not to miss out. So yeah, that's it. I'll leave it up to you, Jasmine, to end the event. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you all. Cheers.